The journey began when the Wilson family moved into a secluded house deep in the forests of northern India. The father, Robert, had always been drawn to the wilderness, especially its mysterious creatures. He'd spent his life as a wildlife researcher and had an obsession with animals that were often misunderstood. One of his favorites was the dhole. The dhole, also known as the Asian wild dog, had a haunting reputation in local folklore. Robert believed that moving to a remote area surrounded by wild animals would be the perfect environment for his young daughter, Lily, to grow up and for his research to flourish. The house was large, old, and had a history of being abandoned for years, which Robert found alluring. The house sat near the edge of a vast forest, and every evening the cries of distant animals filled the air, adding to the house's eerie atmosphere. However, things felt off from the beginning. The villagers whispered about the forest, saying it was cursed, and warned the family to never venture too deep into the woods. But Robert dismissed these as local superstition. His excitement over the idea of studying wildlife overshadowed any fears. What they didn't know was that something ancient and malevolent resided in the woods, waiting for the right time to make itself known. One day, after a long hike through the woods, Robert ventured off the trail in search of rare wildlife. As he moved deeper into the thicket, he stumbled upon an eerie sight, a lone dhole, battered and scarred, its eyes burning with an intelligence far beyond what Robert had expected. The animal did not run, nor did it appear to be frightened. Instead, it slowly approached Robert, locking eyes with him. Robert marveled at the creature, thinking it might be wounded or disoriented, but something about the encounter felt unnatural. The dhole's gaze seemed to pierce his very soul, and for a brief moment Robert thought it might communicate with him. He instinctively reached out, but the dhole snarled, warning him to stay back. The next day, Robert returned home with the strange image of the animal in his mind, unaware that this encounter would mark the beginning of a terrifying descent into madness. Over the next few nights, the family began hearing odd noises coming from the woods, strange howls echoing through the trees, unsettling and unnatural. Lily, their 8-year-old daughter, would stare out the window at night, whispering to herself in a language that Robert could not understand. It wasn't long before Lily began insisting that her new friend was watching her from the woods. At first, Robert chalked Lily's strange behavior up to her overactive imagination. But as the days passed, Lily's obsession with the dhole grew. She would sit for hours by the window, speaking in low whispers to something unseen. When her parents asked her about it, she would smile cryptically and simply say, "He talks to me. He wants to be my friend." Her skin began to look pale, and her once playful demeanor turned dark and distant. Lily became withdrawn, no longer interested in her toys or games, only fixated on the woods outside. Then, one night, Robert heard her talking to herself in a language that sounded both alien and familiar, like the howls of a dhole. He rushed to her room, only to find her standing by the window, her eyes wide with an unsettling gleam. Lily's voice had deepened, almost as if another entity had taken over her body. She no longer seemed like his daughter. Her movements grew more erratic. That night Robert heard a howl, not from the woods but from Lily herself. A chilling, guttural sound that chilled him to the bone. Something had changed in her. The girl he once knew was slipping away. Robert's concern turned to fear as Lily's behavior became more erratic. She began waking up in the middle of the night, wandering into the yard in her pajamas, staring blankly at the moon. Her parents would find her standing motionless by the fence, whispering to something only she could see. It was then that Robert realized the unthinkable. Lily was no longer just obsessed with the dhole. She was becoming one. Her skin grew rougher, her hair thinner, and patches of fur began to sprout on her arms. She would scratch at the door and howl at the moon like an animal in pain. One night, Robert heard a low, menacing growl coming from Lily's room. He found her kneeling on the floor, her eyes reflecting the predatory gleam of the wild dole he had encountered in the forest. Lily looked up at him and grinned, her teeth sharper than before. She whispered, "He's coming for me. I will join the pack." The next day, Robert found strange bite marks on his arms, though he hadn't been near any wild animals. His daughter's transformation was accelerating, and he could feel the presence of something ancient and sinister surrounding them. Days later, a local villager named Raj was found dead near the edge of the forest, his body mangled and drained of life. The death was puzzling. There were no signs of struggle, no animal tracks, nothing that pointed to the cause of death. Yet, the expression frozen on Raj's face was one of sheer terror. His eyes were wide open, staring into the dark, and the skin on his neck had been clawed in a way no human could do. The most disturbing part was the strange, bloodied paw prints that led away from his body, leading deeper into the forest. Robert knew something was wrong but dismissed it as coincidence. But as more strange occurrences began to happen around the house, Robert couldn't shake the feeling that Lily's condition was tied to the strange deaths. The howls had grown louder and more frequent at night, and each day Lily seemed to slip further away from her human form. Then, one evening, as the family sat in the living room, a series of shrill howls echoed from the woods, growing closer and closer. The sound was deafening, almost like a warning. Robert's desperation grew as he searched for any answers to what was happening to Lily. He had heard the villagers speak in hushed tones about the forest, but their words had always seemed too fantastical to believe. However, after Raj's death and witnessing Lily's transformation firsthand, Robert realized the village's warnings weren't just superstition. They were based on something real. He began researching the local history, delving into old books and speaking with the village elders. It was then that he uncovered the terrifying legend of the Dole spirit. The Dole, known as the wild spirit, was said to be a creature bound to the forest, capable of possessing humans. According to the ancient tale, those who formed a bond with the Dole were marked, destined to lose their humanity and become one with the pack. The Dole spirit was ancient, a guardian of the forest, and it would seek out those who were weak of will, those who were drawn to its haunting calls. Over time, the spirit would consume them entirely, transforming them into a creature of the pack. The villagers spoke of a curse that had been placed on the forest centuries ago, an unholy pact between the forest and an ancient tribe that had invoked the Dole spirit for protection. But the pact had gone wrong, and the spirit turned against them, cursing anyone who ventured too deep into the woods. Robert now understood that Lily's strange behavior was not a simple case of imagination. It was the Dole spirit claiming her. But what terrified him more was the realization that the curse wasn't just affecting his daughter. It was pulling in everything and everyone connected to her, and if he couldn't stop it, Lily would become a monster beyond saving. As the days wore on, Lily's transformation grew more intense. Her once bright eyes now glowed with a pale, unnatural light. She no longer looked like his daughter. She looked like something wild, something primal. She had stopped speaking to her parents altogether, communicating only through guttural growls or piercing howls that echoed through the house at night. Robert watched helplessly as his little girl, who once loved playing with her stuffed animals, reading stories and baking cookies, slowly deteriorated into a creature of the forest. The physical changes were undeniable. Her skin became rough and scarred, patches of fur sprouted on her arms and legs, and her nails elongated into sharp claws. Her behavior was even more erratic. She would pace the house at night, running in circles and sniffing at the air as though tracking something unseen. Worst of all, she began to mirror the behaviors of the Dole she had befriended. Robert tried to confront her, but every time he did, Lily would bare her teeth and growl at him, a deep animalistic sound that sent shivers down his spine. He no longer recognized her. His daughter was slipping further and further into the thrall of the dull spirit, and Robert was powerless to stop it. Each day it seemed as though the dull had a stronger hold over her, and Lily seemed to grow more attuned to the forest's call. The tension in the house grew unbearable as Robert and his wife, Emily, tried to deal with Lily's increasingly violent behavior. They could no longer keep her locked in her room. She had become too strong, too wild. One night, Emily found Lily, standing in the middle of the yard staring up at the moon, her hands held high in the air as though calling out to something. Her body was contorted, and her spine had twisted in a way that seemed unnatural for a human. Emily screamed for Robert, and together they tried to pull her back into the house, but Lily fought them off with unnatural strength. She seemed to be fueled by some primal force that they couldn't comprehend. Emily, terrified, begged Lily to come back to them, to remember who she was. But Lily's eyes were no longer human. They were filled with the cold predatory gleam of the dole. As the days went on, Robert and Emily realized that they were losing their daughter for good. They tried to flee the house, but the forest seemed to trap them in place. Every time they tried to leave, something would draw them back in. The whispers of the dull spirit echoed through the trees, and the howls grew louder at night as though the pack was closing in on them. It was as though the very forest itself had become alive, its branches reaching out to claim them. The once idyllic surroundings now felt like a prison, and Robert and Emily's minds began to unravel under the pressure of the curse. They were being slowly consumed by the forest, by the dull spirit that had claimed their daughter. And there seemed to be no way out. As the moon began to rise to its fullest, Robert and Emily's worst fears were realized. They had spent weeks trying to understand what was happening, but now they could no longer deny the truth. The dull spirit had claimed their daughter. On the night of the full moon, the house was surrounded by a pack of wild dulls. They stood, motionless in the yard, their eyes glowing eerily in the darkness. There was no sound, no rustling of leaves, no howling, just an oppressive silence that seemed to suffocate everything around them. Robert watched in horror as Lily walked to the edge of the yard, her steps fluid and graceful like that of a wild animal. She stood with her back to her parents, her arms outstretched as though waiting for something. It was then that the first howl pierced the air. It was not from the pack of dulls, but from Lily herself, a bone-chilling, guttural sound that was both human and animal. The pack responded, howling in unison, their voices rising in a chorus that echoed through the trees. Lily turned around, her face contorted into a feral grin. She was no longer a child, she was one with the pack. Robert and Emily tried to run, but they found themselves paralyzed by fear. The dulls closed in around them, their eyes glowing with an unnatural hunger. The pack was calling to Lily, beckoning her to join them in the forest. And now there was nothing that could stop it. On that fateful night, Robert and Emily realized that the daughter they had known was gone forever. As the pack of dulls surrounded the house, Lily's transformation reached its final stage. Her body twisted and contorted in ways no human body could, and her spine cracked as it lengthened, becoming more like a dull's. Her hair fell out in clumps, replaced by patches of dark, coarse fur. Her face elongated into the snout of a wild dog, her teeth sharp and glistening in the moonlight. Lily let out a blood-curdling howl, one that shook the very earth beneath them. The pack answered, and together they moved in sync, a collective force of nature driven by the dull spirit. Robert and Emily, unable to comprehend what they were witnessing, stood frozen in horror as their daughter, now an unrecognizable beast, joined the pack. There was no turning back. The Dole spirit had consumed Lily entirely, and there was no hope of bringing her back. The house, now abandoned, stood as a dark monument to the cursed land and the family that had once lived there. The forest remained, untouched and ever guarded by the wild creatures within. Though Robert and Emily tried to escape, their efforts were in vain. The forest had already claimed them. As they fled the house, they realized they were being hunted. The howls of the pack grew louder, closer, until they seemed to be right behind them. They ran through the forest, but every turn led them deeper into the thicket. It was as if the very trees were conspiring against them, twisting and changing to lead them further astray. Robert could hear the sound of paws against the ground, the relentless pursuit of the Dole pack drawing closer. Finally, they came to a clearing where the full moon illuminated the ground. The Doles were waiting for them, their eyes glowing with an eerie light. Robert and Emily had nowhere left to run. The pack was upon them, and there was no escape from the curse that had consumed their family. In the end, they were absorbed into the forest, lost to its dark, eternal embrace. Years passed, and the house was left to rot, forgotten by most. But some locals still remember the Wilson family, speaking of them in hushed tones. They whisper of the daughter who became one with the Dole pack, a creature that roams the forest howling to the moon. Sometimes when the wind is just right, the sound of her cries can still be heard, a reminder of the terrible curse that had claimed her. The forest remains dark and foreboding, untouched by time. And the legend of the Dole spirit continues to haunt those who dare to venture too deep, for those who form a bond with it are never truly free. The curse lives on, waiting for its next victim.